The silence that followed the screech of the heart monitor was more violent than any scream. For 7 hours, the air in the Montgomery mansion had been thick with the scent of expensive antiseptic and the heavy, humid weight of impending failure. Dr. Michael Sterling, the 20th specialist to attempt a resuscitation that night, slowly pulled his hands away from the infant's chest, his fingers trembling against his white lab coat. He didn't look at the clock. He didn't need to. He simply stepped back, the motion mirrored by the other 19 elite physicians, who stood like a wall of ivory-colored defeat under the crystal chandeliers. "Time of death," he whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of a $40 billion tragedy. 0200 hours. The words hit Arthur Montgomery like a physical blow. The billionaire, a man who had built empires on ruthless logic and surgical precision, was now a ghost of a man, his blue designer suit crumpled as he collapsed onto a stool in the kitchen-side medical suite. He didn't cry out, he simply sat there, his power rendered useless, staring at the high-tech incubator that had become his son's coffin. Behind him, the 20 world-renowned specialists, men and women flown in from Geneva, Tokyo and Johns Hopkins, lowered their heads. They had used every drug in the pharmacopoeia and every machine known to modern science, yet they were walking away from a tiny body that had turned the color of twilight. In the corner of the room, near the service entrance, Jorge Cabrera stood in the deep shadows. He was a boy in a shredded denim coat, with holes in the elbows, a teenager who had spent his life being invisible on the margins of such immense wealth. While the geniuses in the room were staring at their digital readouts and blood gas levels, Jorge was staring at the baby's skin. He saw the strange, raised welts of the rash, and the way the child's body seemed to be radiating an unnatural, trapped heat. He remembered a dusty village in his past, a sibling he couldn't save, and a grandmother's voice that told him how the body sometimes traps its own fire until the heart simply stops. The doctors began to pack their leather bags, their movements mechanical and hushed, already drafting the legal justifications for their failure. They had signed the death certificate of an empire's heir, and they were ready to retreat into the safety of their Ivy League credentials. But Jorge felt a pull in his chest, an inheritance of wisdom that had no degree attached to it. He knew that if he did nothing, he would remain safe and invisible, but the baby would stay dead. If he acted, he was risking prison, a murder charge, and the destruction of the only life he knew. He took a breath that tasted of ozone and expensive failure, tightened his grip on the tattered sleeves of his coat, and stepped out from the shadows toward the kitchen sink. "Would you like me to write the next chapter, where Jorge makes his move and the great theft begins?" Jorge Cabrera did not exist in the eyes of the city, and that was exactly how he survived. Before he was the boy in the shadows of the Montgomery mansion, he was the boy of the concrete underpasses and the steam vents behind the Sterling Heights Medical Center. His world was a patchwork of discarded things, much like the oversized denim coat he wore, which was tattered at the elbows and frayed at the hem, held together by sheer necessity and the memory of a warmer life. To the residents of the high-rise apartments, he was part of the urban scenery, as unremarkable as a cracked sidewalk or a rusted street sign, but Jorge saw everything because no one ever bothered to look at him. Life on the streets had taught Jorge that the greatest luxury was not gold but heat. He had spent his winters huddled near the hospital's exhaust pipes, listening to the hum of multi-million-dollar machinery that kept the wealthy alive while he froze just inches away from the source. He survived by collecting scraps, turning the refuse of the elite into the sustenance of the forgotten. It was during one of these foraging trips near the medical center's service entrance that he first encountered the frantic energy of the Montgomery detail. He had watched the black SUVs tear through the gates, carrying a dying child and a broken billionaire, and in the chaos of their arrival, Jorge had found a gap in the perimeter. He hadn't planned to infiltrate the estate. He had simply been looking for a place where the air didn't bite quite so hard. He moved through the mansion's service corridors with the practiced silence of a ghost, a skill honed by years of avoiding the heavy-handed security guards of the downtown plazas. In this world of marble and silk, his denim coat felt like a suit of armor made of lead, heavy with the dust of the streets and the scent of wood smoke from the village he had left behind years ago. That village had been a place of dust and ancient remedies, where his grandmother had whispered secrets about the body's hidden fires, knowledge that was currently worth more than the 20 Ivy League degrees debating in the room next door. Jorge had ended up in the shadows of the kitchen-side medical suite, not by invitation, but by an instinct he couldn't name. He had watched from behind the heavy oak doors, a trespasser in a palace of grief, seeing the experts fail while he recognized the true face of the infant's suffering. He stood there, a homeless teenager in a shredded coat, holding a lifetime of street-smart intuition and forgotten wisdom, waiting for the moment when being invisible would no longer be an option. The nursery was not a room, it was a cathedral of glass and chrome, a $40 million vault where every breath was measured by a computer and every heartbeat was graphed in neon light. At its center lay baby Julian, the heir to the Montgomery dynasty, looking less like a living child and more like a porcelain doll shattered from within. He was encased in a state-of-the-art thermal incubator that hummed with a low predatory vibration, draped in high-tech weighted blankets that cost more than Jorge had earned in his entire life. To the 20 doctors circling the crib, these were the pinnacle of human achievement. To Jorge, watching from the kitchen-side shadow, it looked like a golden prison. The baby's skin had transitioned from a pale peach to a terrifying bruised indigo, matted with a rash that resembled a map of a burning city. Every few minutes, a tremor would ripple through his tiny frame, a neurological seizure so violent it caused the banks of monitors to erupt in a cacophony of electronic panic. The air in the room was stifling, kept at a precise, elevated temperature by the hospital-grade climate control, based on the lead doctor's theory that the infant's body was struggling with hypothermic shock. They were fighting a phantom cold, wrapping the child in layers of artificial heat, oblivious to the fact that the heat was the very thing fueling the fire in the baby's blood. Dr. Sterling adjusted the settings on the thermal blanket, his brow furrowed as he watched the digital readout of Julian's internal temperature. "He's still dropping," the doctor muttered, his voice tight with the frustration of a man who believed nature could be bullied by a checkbook. "Increase the thermal output by another 5%. We need to stabilize his core." Jorge felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. From his vantage point, he could see what the geniuses missed. The way the baby's eyes were rolling back, not from lack of energy, but from an overload of it. He remembered his grandmother's old-world warnings about the fever of the earth, a rare condition where the body's cooling system misfires, causing it to cook from the inside out. In the village, they treated it with the shock of the stream. Here they were treating it with a furnace. The advanced sensors and the $50,000 consultations were creating a feedback loop of death. The more the baby's heart raced to keep up with the rising heat, the more the machines detected instability, leading the doctors to apply even more heat-based interventions. It was a clinical tragedy. These titans of medicine were staring so hard at their tablets and their complex chemical charts that they had stopped looking at the patient. They were treating a series of numbers, not a human being. They saw a respiratory failure, so they pumped him with oxygen that dried his lungs. They saw a seizure, so they injected sedatives that suppressed his heart. Each advanced treatment was a new brick in the wall they were building around the child's chance of survival. Jorge could see the baby's chest hitching, a tiny, desperate movement that the weighted blankets were slowly crushing. The Prince of Sterling Heights was being smothered by the very wealth meant to save him, and as the 20th doctor reached for a needle to administer yet another round of useless stimulants, Jorge realized that the clock had finally run out. The golden prison had become a tomb, and only an unthinkable act of poverty could break it open. The scent of the billionaire's kitchen, expensive espresso and ozone began to fade, replaced in Jorge's mind by the sharp, dry smell of parched earth and wood smoke. As he watched the specialists fumbling with their glowing tablets, his consciousness drifted back to a village that didn't appear on any modern map. He was 6 years old again, standing on a porch made of salvaged timber, watching his grandmother, Abuela Rosa, move through a heat wave that had turned the horizon into a shimmering lake of fire. The village had been gripped by the same silence that now haunted this mansion, a silence born of the realization that the local medicine man's prayers had failed. He remembered his younger brother, Mateo, lying on a woven mat, his skin turning that same terrifying shade of twilight blue Jorge saw now in the incubator. The village elders had called it the stone fever, believing the blood was turning to lead. They had wrapped Mateo in heavy wool blankets, trying to sweat the sickness out, much like these doctors were doing with their pressurized thermal wraps. He could still hear Mateo's shallow, rasping gasps, the sound of a bird trapped in a box. Abuela Rosa had walked into the room, her face a map of deep lines and ancient certainty, and she had done something that had made the entire village scream in protest. She had stripped the blankets away, exposing the boy's burning skin to the air, and then she had carried him out to the stone well at the center of the yard. Jorge remembered the way the dust had puffed up around her bare feet, a memory of grit and heat. "The body is a forge, Jorge," she had whispered to him that day, her voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across a floor. "When the fire grows too hot, the metal becomes brittle. If you do not quench it, the soul cracks." She had plunged Mateo into the bucket of ice-cold well water. It had been a violent, shocking sight, the boy's body convulsing against the freeze, his lungs letting out a jagged, piercing cry that seemed to shatter the heat of the afternoon. The memory was so vivid that Jorge could almost feel the phantom splash of cold water on his own face. He remembered the transition, the way Mateo's skin had flushed from blue back to a raw, healthy red, the way the rolling seizures had gone still as the cold reset the electrical storm in his brain. The doctors in this mansion were looking for a complex chemical intruder, a virus or a toxin they could name and categorize, but Jorge knew they were looking at a simple elemental imbalance. The baby's internal thermostat had broken, and the advanced medicine was merely stoking the furnace. He looked at his own hands, calloused and stained with the soot of the city, and then at the tattered denim of his coat sleeves. He was a boy built of dust and street scraps, standing in a temple of glass. He had no degrees, no standing, and no right to be there. But the memory of Mateo's first clear breath after the well water was a heartbeat in his ear, steady and demanding. Abuela Rosa had taught him that sometimes the only way to save a life was to be brave enough to be misunderstood. He knew now that the blue skin fever wasn't a mystery to be solved with a microscope, it was a fire that needed to be put out. The memory of the dust and the well wasn't just a ghost of his past, it was a set of instructions. He looked at the kitchen sink, then at the dying air, and the fear that had kept him invisible began to burn away, replaced by the cold, clear weight of a grandmother's legacy. Would you like me to move on to Chapter 4, where Jorge finds the gap in security and prepares to make his move? The transition from the world of memory back to the sterile precision of the Montgomery mansion was like a slap to the face. Jorge stood frozen in the service corridor, the tattered hem of his denim coat brushing against the baseboards that cost more than a year of his grandmother's rent. The medical suite was a fortress, and between him and the dying child stood a wall of men with earpieces and broad shoulders, the elite security detail of a man who believed money could buy a perimeter against death itself. But Jorge had spent 3 years learning the architecture of the ignored. He knew that the more expensive a security system was, the more it relied on the assumption that the threat would come from someone who mattered. He watched from behind the industrial refrigerator, his eyes scanning the room not for cameras but for habits. Briggs, the head of security, was a man of ironclad routine, but even he was fraying under the atmospheric pressure of the billionaire's grief. Every 12 minutes, Briggs would glance at the primary heart monitor, and for exactly 6 seconds, his focus would shift from the door to the digital readout. In the street, Jorge had learned that a man looking at a screen is a man who is blind to the shadows. He also noticed the shift change. The 2 guards at the kitchen side entrance were being replaced by a fresh pair from the external perimeter. For a heartbeat of 20 seconds, the new guards would be adjusting their equipment, their eyes recalibrating to the dim blue-lit interior from the harsh floodlights of the lawn. Jorge didn't move like an intruder. He moved like smoke. He timed his breath to the rhythm of the oscillating fans in the corner, sliding along the marble counter with a grace born of dodging transit police in crowded terminals. He reached the gap just as the shift change guards turned to exchange a brief hushed word about the weather. Jorge didn't run. Running created wind and noise. He drifted. He used the high profile of the professional espresso machine as a temporary blind, then dropped to his hands and knees to navigate the dead zone of the overhead 360-degree camera. He knew that the most dangerous part was the Billionaire's wall, the invisible line between the service staff and the family. He utilized a discarded silver serving tray, holding it at an angle to reflect the corridor's lighting back at the nearest lens, creating a momentary flare that masked his silhouette. He was a boy who had mapped the blind spots of the city's most dangerous alleys. A mansion was just a larger, cleaner maze. He felt the vibration of footsteps, heavy, polished boots, and pressed himself so flat against the mahogany paneling that he felt like part of the grain. The guards were looking for a contact, a breach, a professional. They weren't looking for a boy in a frayed coat who knew how to breathe without making his chest move. He reached the final door, the one leading into the kitchen-side medical suite, where the kitchen sink stood just feet away from the high-tech incubator. He could hear the low, frantic murmurs of the 20 doctors, the sound of a dynasty crumbling. He was inside the inner sanctum now, a trespasser in the temple of the elite, standing in the one spot the guards hadn't checked because they couldn't conceive of a nobody having the audacity to be there. He was one step away from the unthinkable, his heart hammering against the denim of his coat like a trapped bird, waiting for the final flat line that would signal the start of his war. The silence that followed the doctor's declaration of death was not a peaceful one. It was a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room, leaving only the sterile hum of useless machines. Arthur Montgomery sat like a statue carved from grief, his eyes fixed on the blue, unmoving form of his son. The 20 doctors began to retreat, their shoulders slumped under the weight of a failure that no amount of money could fix. It was in this moment of total, absolute despair, the second when the guards lowered their gaze and the parents surrendered to the dark, that Jorge Cabrera ceased to be a shadow. He didn't hesitate. Hesitation was for people with something to lose, and Jorge had lost everything long before he stepped into this mansion. He lunged from the darkness of the service corridor, a blur of tattered denim and desperate intent. The sound of his sneakers hitting the marble floor was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Before the nearest specialist could even register the presence of an intruder, Jorge had reached the $2 million incubator. His hands, calloused and stained by the streets, didn't tremble as he tore away the high-tech weighted blankets that were acting as a funeral shroud. "Hey, what are you doing?" Dr. Sterling's voice erupted in a jagged spike of panic. Jorge didn't answer. He reached into the climate-controlled chamber and scooped the tiny, limp body of Julian into his arms. The baby felt like a bundle of sun-baked stones, radiating a heat that was terrifying to the touch. The room exploded into a symphony of outrage. Guards reached for their holsters, doctors shouted for security, and Eleanor Montgomery let out a piercing, guttural scream of maternal terror as she saw a nobody in a shredded coat snatching her child's body from the altar of science. "Stop him! He's got the baby!" Briggs roared, his heavy boots thundering across the floor. Jorge banked left, using the momentum of his sprint to weave past the reaching arms of a neurologist. He felt a hand snag the shoulder of his denim coat, the fabric groaning as it tore further, but he twisted out of the grasp with the eel-like agility of a boy who had spent his life dodging the consequences of being alive. He wasn't running for the exit, he was running for the center of the kitchen, toward the wide industrial sink that stood like a silver monolith under the recessed lighting. The chaos was absolute. Chairs were overturned, medical trays sent clattering to the floor, and the 20 greatest medical minds in the world were reduced to a confused, shouting mob. Arthur Montgomery had risen from his stool, his face a mask of primal fury, his hands outstretched as if to crush the boy who had dared to touch his legacy. But Jorge was faster. He reached the island counter, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard it threatened to crack them. He could feel the guards closing in, the heat of their breath, the shadow of their reach. He had 3 seconds before they tackled him to the marble, 3 seconds before he was buried under a mountain of security and labeled a kidnapper or a killer. In that final breathless heartbeat, Jorge pivoted, shielding the baby with his own body, and reached for the chrome handle of the faucet. The unthinkable had begun, and there was no turning back. The chrome handle of the faucet gave way with a sharp metallic click, and the water came down in a sudden violent torrent. It was a brutal sound, the splash of cold life hitting the stainless steel of the industrial sink, slicing through the panicked roar of the room like a blade. Jorge did not look up, even as the shadow of Briggs loomed over him and the enraged cry of Arthur Montgomery shook the very walls of the mansion. He held the baby with a grip that was both iron and velvet, tilting the small indigo-hued body until the back of Julian's neck and the curve of his spine were positioned directly beneath the icy stream. The room froze in a collective gasp of horror. To the 20 doctors, it was an act of desecration, a primitive assault on a body they had treated with the delicacy of a glass artifact. To the billionaire, it was the final, unforgivable insult to his grief. Montgomery stood just feet away, his face contorted into a mask of such visceral agony and rage that he seemed barely human, a white handkerchief clutched in a trembling hand as he choked on a breath that wouldn't come. Behind him, the female specialist in the white coat clutched her lapels, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream of no, while the other doctors stood paralyzed, their eyes wide as they witnessed what they believed was the cold-blooded drowning of a dead heir. Jorge felt the splashback of the water hitting his own hands, the cold so sharp it felt like a burn. He ignored the fingers digging into the shoulders of his denim coat, ignored the guard's hand that was inches away from slamming him into the counter. He was focused entirely on the heat radiating from the baby that trapped subterranean fire that was cooking the child's brain. In his mind, he wasn't in a billionaire's kitchen anymore. He was back at the well with Abuela Rosa, watching the stone fever break under the mercy of the chill. "Get your hands off him." Montgomery finally found his voice, a jagged, broken sound that carried the weight of a death sentence. "I will kill you for this. Someone grab him." The water cascaded over Julian's head and chest, matting the fine dark hair and washing away the expensive useless ointments the doctors had applied hours ago. For 5 agonizing seconds, the baby remained as limp as a wet rag, the grey-blue tint of his skin clashing horribly with the bright, sterile light of the kitchen. A doctor stepped forward, his face flushed with professional outrage. "You're inducing shock. You're destroying the last of the tissue integrity," he screamed, reaching for Jorge's arm. But Jorge didn't flinch. He leaned in closer, his lips moving in a silent prayer he didn't know he remembered. He was the boy who had survived the streets by knowing when to stand still, and right now his stillness was a wall against the world's madness. He could feel the internal vibration of the baby's body, the electrical storm of the seizure hitting a wall of ice. The water was a reset, a physical shock to a system that had been overheated by advanced medicine until it had simply given up. The guards were upon him now, 4 pairs of heavy hands seizing the tattered fabric of his coat, ready to tear him away from the sink and throw him onto the cold marble floor. Montgomery was lunging forward, his eyes bloodshot and wild, ready to reclaim the body of his son from the nobody who had dared to touch it. Jorge closed his eyes, bracing for the impact, his fingers still steady under the tap, waiting for the one thing that no machine in that room had been able to produce. The moment of impact arrived with the weight of a falling star. Briggs's massive hand slammed onto Jorge's shoulder, a crushing force intended to pin him to the marble, while Arthur Montgomery's fingers clawed at Jorge's tattered denim sleeve to pull him back. The water continued to roar against the stainless steel, a relentless, icy curtain that seemed to be the only moving thing in a world that had gone suddenly, terrifyingly still. The air in the kitchen was charged with a tension so thick it felt as though the oxygen itself might ignite. Every eye was fixed on the limp, grey form of the baby whose head hung back over Jorge's steady palms, drenched and unmoving under the cold stream. Then it happened. It began as a microscopic shudder, a ripple of movement beneath the bruised indigo of Julian's skin that was felt only by Jorge. It was a subterranean shift, the breaking of a frozen sea. The baby's chest, which had been as flat and hollow as a forgotten drum, suddenly heaved. It was a sharp, jagged contraction, a physical rejection of the death that had been settling into his bones. A single large bubble of water and air escaped Julian's lips, followed by a sound that tore through the sterile silence of the mansion like a thunderclap. It was a cry, but it wasn't the weak, fading whimper of a dying child. It was a loud roar and piercing scream of absolute life, a primal protest against the cold, against the dark, and against the failure of the world. The hands that were tearing at Jorge's coat suddenly froze. Briggs' grip loosened, his fingers going slack as his mouth dropped open in a look of stunned, childlike bewilderment. Arthur Montgomery stopped mid-lunge, his body trembling, his face a ghostly white as he stared at the son who had been declared dead 2 minutes ago. The baby's skin was transforming before their eyes. The terrifying blue was receding, replaced by a violent, healthy flush of crimson as the cold water shock reset the heart's rhythm and the blood began to surge once more through the tiny, rejuvenated veins. "He's breathing," a doctor whispered, the words sounding like a prayer in the middle of a war zone. The 20 specialists, who had stood as a wall of Ivory League defeat, broke their formation. They swarmed the sink. But this time, their movements weren't filled with the arrogant precision of experts. They were frantic with the desperation of people witnessing the impossible. Dr. Sterling, the man who had signed the death certificate, pushed his way to the front, his hands shaking as he pressed a stethoscope against the infant's wet, shivering chest. He went perfectly still for 3 seconds, his eyes wide and unfocused as he listened to the frantic, beautiful gallop of a heart that had been silent. "The heart rate. It's normal," Sterling gasped, his voice barely audible over the sound of the running faucet. "The neurological storm has cleared. The thermal shock. It worked. He's not seized. He's just cold." The chaos that followed was different from the panic of the medical failure. It was the chaos of a miracle. Nurses scrambled for warm, dry towels, not the pressurized thermal wraps, but simple, soft cotton. The monitors that had flatlined were reconnected, and as the sensors touched Julian's skin, the room was filled with the rhythmic, steady beep, beep, beep of a life reclaimed. The 20 greatest medical minds in the world stood in a circle around a kitchen sink, staring in silent, humbled disbelief at the display of a street boy's primitive wisdom. Jorge stood back, his denim coat soaked and heavy, his arms still aching from the weight of the child. He watched as Eleanor Montgomery fell to her knees, not in grief but in a sobbing, hysterical gratitude, reaching out to touch her son's wet toes. The billionaire turned his gaze from the baby to Jorge. The rage was gone, replaced by a look of profound, soul-deep shock. The man who owned the city was looking at the boy who owned nothing, and for the first time in his life, Arthur Montgomery was the one who felt small. The silence was gone, replaced by the loud, healthy wail of an heir who had been brought back from the edge of the abyss by a memory of dust and a stream of cold water. The adrenaline that had sustained Jorge through the great theft vanished the instant the baby was taken from his arms, leaving his limbs feeling like heavy, waterlogged timber. The transition from savior to suspect happened in the blink of an eye. Even as Julian's healthy cries filled the kitchen, the machinery of the Montgomery estate's security reacted to the initial breach with cold, mechanical efficiency. Briggs, recovering from his momentary shock, barked a command that cut through the doctor's murmurs. Before Jorge could even wipe the cold spray of the sink from his eyes, 2 massive guards tackled him to the marble floor. The impact was jarring. Jorge's face was pressed against the cold stone, the tattered denim of his coat snagging as his arms were wrenched behind his back. The metal of the handcuffs bit into his wrists with a sharp, clinical coldness. To the security team, the miracle at the sink was a secondary detail. Their primary directive was the neutralization of a trespasser who had laid hands on the principal. Jorge didn't struggle. He lay there, smelling the floor wax and the faint scent of the charcoal he had brushed past, his heart finally slowing as he watched the scene above him from his place on the ground. "Search him," Briggs growled, his knee pinning Jorge's shoulder blade. "Call the precinct. I want him processed for attempted murder and kidnapping." But the room was no longer under the control of the guards. Above Jorge, the medical monitors began to chime a different tune, a rhythmic, melodic pulse that signified stability. The digital displays, which had been flat and grey for what felt like an eternity, were suddenly glowing a vibrant, steady green. Dr. Sterling was hunched over the infant, his face mere inches from the baby's, his stethoscope moving with a frantic, renewed purpose. "It's impossible," Sterling whispered, though the word was no longer a dismissal but a confession. "His core temperature is normalizing. The seizure activity has vanished. The boy, he reset the autonomic system. He saved him." Arthur Montgomery stood frozen, his eyes darting between the rhythmic green light of the monitors and the boy pinned like an animal to the floor. The billionaire's face was a battleground of conflicting realities. He was a man who had been taught that the world was ordered by pedigree and purchase, yet he was staring at a miracle performed by a child who wore his poverty like a second skin. "Mr. Montgomery, we're taking him out now," Briggs said, hauling Jorge upward by his bound arms. Jorge winced, his oversized denim coat riding up his back, exposing his thin, bruised ribs to the harsh light of the room. He looked at the floor, waiting for the inevitable journey to a concrete cell, accepting the price of the life he had just ransomed. "Wait!" The word was quiet, but it carried the weight of the Montgomery name. Arthur Montgomery stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Jorge. He looked at the tattered sleeves, the dirt beneath the boy's fingernails, and the raw, quiet dignity in Jorge's eyes. "Let him go," Montgomery commanded. Briggs hesitated, his hands still tight on the handcuffs. "Sir," he broke every protocol. He put his hands on the air. He could have... "I said let him go." Montgomery's voice rose to a roar, an echo of the power he usually used to crush competitors, now turned toward his own walls. "Look at the screen, Briggs. Look at my son. That boy did what 20 of the best minds on earth couldn't do. He didn't come here to steal. He came here to give us the only thing my money couldn't buy." The room went silent as Briggs slowly, almost reluctantly, turned the key in the handcuffs. The metal clicked open, and Jorge's arms fell limp at his sides. He rubbed his wrists, his gaze shifting to the female doctor, who was now wrapping Julian in a simple dry cloth. She looked at Jorge, not with the clinical condescension she had shown earlier, but with a profound, humbled respect. Arthur Montgomery walked toward Jorge, stopping only inches away. For a long moment, the two stood in total silence, the man who owned everything and the boy who owned nothing. Montgomery reached out, and for a heartbeat, Jorge flinched, expecting a strike. Instead, the billionaire placed a heavy, trembling hand on the tattered denim of Jorge's shoulder. "You saved my life today, Jorge Cabrera," Montgomery said, his voice thick with an emotion that transcended class. "Because without him, I have nothing." Jorge looked up, the weight of the street and the shadow finally lifting. He wasn't a trespasser anymore. He was the only person in the room who had known the way back from the dark. The guards stepped back, creating a path for the boy they had just pinned to the floor, and for the first time in his life, Jorge Cabrera didn't feel the need to move like smoke. He stood in the light, and the world finally looked back. The adrenaline that had sustained Jorge through the great theft vanished the instant the baby was taken from his arms, leaving his limbs feeling like heavy, waterlogged timber. The transition from savior to suspect happened in the blink of an eye. Even as Julian's healthy cries filled the kitchen, the machinery of the Montgomery estate's security reacted to the initial breach with cold, mechanical efficiency. Briggs, recovering from his momentary shock, barked a command that cut through the doctor's murmurs. Before Jorge could even wipe the cold spray of the sink from his eyes, two massive guards tackled him to the marble floor. The impact was jarring. Jorge's face was pressed against the cold stone, the tattered denim of his coat snagging as his arms were wrenched behind his back. The metal of the handcuffs bit into his wrists with a sharp, clinical coldness. To the security team, the miracle at the sink was a secondary detail. Their primary directive was the neutralization of a trespasser who had laid hands on the principal. Jorge didn't struggle. He lay there, smelling the floor wax and the faint scent of the charcoal he had brushed past, his heart finally slowing as he watched the scene above him from his place on the ground. "Search him," Briggs growled, his knee pinning Jorge's shoulder blade. "Call the precinct. I want him processed for attempted murder and kidnapping." But the room was no longer under the control of the guards. Above Jorge, the medical monitors began to chime a different tune, a rhythmic, melodic pulse that signified stability. The digital displays, which had been flat and grey for what felt like an eternity, were suddenly glowing a vibrant, steady green. Dr. Sterling was hunched over the infant, his face mere inches from the baby's, his stethoscope moving with a frantic, renewed purpose. "It's impossible," Sterling whispered, though the word was no longer a dismissal but a confession. "His core temperature is normalizing. The seizure activity has vanished. The boy, he reset the autonomic system. He saved him." Arthur Montgomery stood frozen, his eyes darting between the rhythmic green light of the monitors and the boy pinned like an animal to the floor. The billionaire's face was a battleground of conflicting realities. He was a man who had been taught that the world was ordered by pedigree and purchase, yet he was staring at a miracle performed by a child who wore his poverty like a second skin. "Mr. Montgomery, we're taking him out now," Briggs said, hauling Jorge upward by his bound arms. Jorge winced, his oversized denim coat riding up his back, exposing his thin, bruised ribs to the harsh light of the room. He looked at the floor, waiting for the inevitable journey to a concrete cell, accepting the price of the life he had just ransomed. "Wait." The word was quiet, but it carried the weight of the Montgomery name. Arthur Montgomery stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Jorge. He looked at the tattered sleeves, the dirt beneath the boy's fingernails, and the raw, quiet dignity in Jorge's eyes. "Let him go," Montgomery commanded. Briggs hesitated, his hands still tight on the handcuffs. "Sir, he broke every protocol. He put his hands on the air. He could have—" "I said let him go." Montgomery's voice rose to a roar, an echo of the power he usually used to crush competitors, now turned toward his own walls. "Look at the screen, Briggs. Look at my son. That boy did what 20 of the best minds on earth couldn't do. He didn't come here to steal. He came here to give us the only thing my money couldn't buy." The room went silent as Briggs slowly, almost reluctantly, turned the key in the handcuffs. The metal clicked open, and Jorge's arms fell limp at his sides. He rubbed his wrists, his gaze shifting to the female doctor, who was now wrapping Julian in a simple dry cloth. She looked at Jorge, not with the clinical condescension she had shown earlier, but with a profound, humbled respect. Arthur Montgomery walked toward Jorge, stopping only inches away. For a long moment, the two stood in total silence, the man who owned everything and the boy who owned nothing. Montgomery reached out, and for a heartbeat, Jorge flinched, expecting a strike. Instead, the billionaire placed a heavy, trembling hand on the tattered denim of Jorge's shoulder. "You saved my life today, Jorge Cabrera," Montgomery said, his voice thick with an emotion that transcended class. "Because without him, I have nothing." Jorge looked up, the weight of the street and the shadow finally lifting. He wasn't a trespasser anymore. He was the only person in the room who had known the way back from the dark. The guards stepped back, creating a path for the boy they had just pinned to the floor, and for the first time in his life, Jorge Cabrera didn't feel the need to move like smoke. He stood in the light, and the world finally looked back,